morning, ladies and gentlemen. The couch is a very comfortable one. I trust that I will rest comfortably and put everybody else to sleep. All the panelists have been already introduced. My task this morning is merely to orchestrate a conversation from the couch amongst three eminent professionals who have already been introduced on a topic of tremendous concern to us in Trinidad and Tobago today. It is very clear that organized human society requires law and regulations for good order. And as much as we may quarrel about the law and make odious comments from time to time, including the traditional linkage of the law to that four-legged beast of burden, because it becomes an irritant to us in some aspects of our lives. I think all of us would prefer to live in societies where there are laws, if we ever had a choice, as opposed to societies that are lawless or without laws. The question is, however, in all jurisdictions, there are good laws, there are bad laws. And in the best of jurisdictions, there's always room for improvement in legislation and in the legal system, both in terms of the content of the law, but perhaps much more importantly, in the way the law is administered. Law is very important. It is one on a continuum, one aspect of the continuum from values to public policy, and eventually to actions that relate to good governance and development. But law is meaningless unless put into action. So the whole question is the effectiveness of the law, the institutional arrangements that make for effective implementation of the law, and of course the monitoring and evaluation of its usefulness and the extent to which change needs to be effected from time to time, because law is never static. My very pleasant task now is to initiate this conversation by asking Catherine to make an initial presentation.
All right, good morning to all. And let me firstly start off by thanking the Transparency Institute of Trinidad and Tobago for inviting me to be on this panel on the couch. I think that the session like this, and I know it's something that is done annually, is very important for Trinidad and Tobago, particularly as we continue daily to see different transgressions taking place, and we continue to speak about it, and we continue to ask, is it the legislation that is wrong, or is it that the persons who have to follow the legislation are not complying with legislation? It's also interesting to consider, does effective and working legislation make good leaders, or does leadership with integrity make good legislation, bearing in mind that our leaders are the ones who are the legislators, and they are the ones who would eventually be responsible for law. The process of putting legislation on our books, as we would all know, is certainly a very protracted one, and it is by necessity so. As a matter of fact, I did some little work last night looking at the US, and when I thought ours was protracted and long, to go through legislation in the US takes forever. But we have to have checks and balances along the way, as we definitely attempt to arrive at the legislation that will ultimately hold any citizen, any one in government, corporate citizen also, responsible for their actions, and to be able to penalize them when they have not done what is right and there are violations therefrom from it. But in our country, the parliament, who are the leaders of our country, They pass the legislation after debate and amendments, and we expect that in doing so, that they would act as persons full of integrity and use their conscience vote rather than their party line vote in passing legislation. Of course, this statement begins with the assumption that sufficient of our parliamentarians are persons full of honor, driven by their conscience, and that this is the compass that guides all their directions. This assumption alone could probably take us the whole day and throw off everything in the discussion here today. So I think we'll just put that as a marker point and leave that and try to come back to something that we could work with this morning. So I will touch on two possible reasons and why I think legislation does not work, and during the panel discussion, I'm sure that both Ian and Afra will throw out a lot more. Firstly, preparation of a final policy document after consultation with stakeholders. I was previously, as you heard, at the Central Bank and involved in preparation of a policy document for the Finance Act, the Insurance Act, the Credit Union Act, and so. And before we could do anything, our mandate was to develop a proper policy document, because in the policy document, that's where the principles are laid out, that's where the objectives are laid out. And if we don't have that, we really are probably building our house not on a solid foundation. We have seen certainly situations where legislation is drafted just maybe based on a cabinet note and without any in-depth study and without any in-depth statement of what the policy is that should be in that document. We also have a situation where we don't see sufficient consultation at that time, at the time of developing the policy document. So the stakeholders' views are not included from the inception. And if we don't get stakeholders' views from the inception, but rather what we have is a bill that is drafted, given to stakeholders and say, okay, we want to consult, we want to know what you like and what you don't like, it's almost like you're giving me the house half built and now telling me what changes do I want to make. But when the structure is already in the ground, right? When certain things have already been done engineering-wise, how much room do I really have to change this? So we have certainly seen over the years that we would like to see scrap that entire bill, start all over with a proper policy document that defines the objectives and the principles, and let's see if we could have some better legislation. And we do have an example of that. I mean, Afra is here, the procurement bill is one such example, all right, where the private sector, the Joint Civil Society Group, came up with another bill based on principles and objectives that were laid down, that we felt were proper, and thereafter there was discussion back and forth with the government, and a bill was eventually done. We also have the beverage container bill, where what was presented to us for consultation did not match what we think a country that is looking to be a developed country and to take, you know, the environment forward, and so was really what we wanted, and again paid for, well, developed a policy document and then paid for a draftsperson to draft a proper bill, and well, we know that hasn't reached any much further as yet, but we are still working with the ministry that our bill will take some precedence there. Then we have legislation where we have persons acting what I would consider without integrity, and they're involved in the process, and all they're really concerned about is ensuring that their interests are served, and that maybe if not their individual interests, but the interests of a particular group of people are served, and that becomes a mandate almost for preparing the legislation. And if we don't have the diverse group of stakeholders involved to ensure that we have that balance and that any such private motives are ruled out, you can find that you will end up with legislation that is not in the best interest. We also have where insufficient public consultation and opinion is not done, and in those cases we know that it's very difficult to get compliance because you just don't agree with that legislation. It becomes a piece of legislation on the books and we don't get anything out of it. Or we have legislation that is thoroughly done and passed, and then afterwards on hindsight only after a lot of public opinion and a lot of public discourse, we have the legislation being either amended or withdrawn. I mean, we have examples that go way back in history about this internationally and so, but we have our own examples right here on the ground in Trinidad and Tobago, Section 34, the infamous Section 34 being such an example. So we know that it is important, if we want to ensure maximum compliance, that we do consultation and make sure that we get the proper views in, and that's what the legislation is built upon. I think it's important to say also that where we have legislation that is built on the wrong principles, that no amendment to a bill will suffice. No amendment to a bill. Right? We have seen situations where the bill that was taken to Parliament probably did not make sense. In an effort of what was called compromise, amendments were made to the bill, but the bill is still not going to serve the purpose for which it was intended. And then when you look at even the amendments that were made on the floor and through committee stage, it probably makes the bill even a little more cumbersome to really be able to work out. Another a reason why we find legislation may not work is even though we have a well-defined policy document, we end up with the legislation still not working, and we hear some of the reasons being shortage of drafters at the legislative, at the CPC office. And we hear this over and over again. So bills take very long to be drafted, or when they're drafted, there are a lot of inconsistencies with the bill, inconsistencies within the bill, inconsistencies from one bill to the other. I mean, I know this is all tied up with the public service and the difficulty in bringing in people at the competitive rate, but I think for too long we have been using that as an excuse not to get the proper staffing in all of our government offices, not just the CPC's office, but in all of our government offices, so that we could ensure that the right people and the skilled people are there. The competition is there outside in the private sector, and many of the attorneys go in, the draftsperson who are skilled in that drafting, and after a while, I mean, they just don't stay because there are better compensation packages outside. I mentioned before the inconsistencies between one piece of legislation and the other, and it's interesting that Senator Helen Drayton recently spoke about that with respect to the children's bill, and she mentioned that children has all sorts of definitions depending on which act you looked at, and therefore it has to be very confusing, and suggested that all of it be withdrawn and we start all over with proper legislation with respect to the children and dealing with children. So many contradictions we have. And then sometimes we try to put laws in place to solve a problem that we have, to solve a challenge that we have. Maybe, you know, the steeper penalties, as was spoken about recently, for driving under the influence of alcohol. But sometimes the answer is not the legislation. There's an underlying societal issue that we are dealing with, that we need to deal with that. And if we don't deal with that, it's literally like putting a plaster on a sore, and we know what happens afterwards, all right? Underneath will become infected, and we don't really get the answer that we want. So I think we really need to look at the underlying issues of what we're trying to solve with legislation and determine if legislation is really the answer to it or if it's something else. I close by saying in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, we know that enforcement has been a challenge for us. We are plagued with very low enforcement in Trinidad and Tobago and of the laws, and therefore legislation, like I said, may not always be the solution, and ask that we dig deeper into some of the solutions that we need. And as today is all about transparency and governance, certainly whilst legislation would help, there needs to be the honorable person, the character that would take us forward as a country to ensure that we have transparency, good governance, and that we can compete in the world outside there. So I'll close at that and leave it to the other.
Thank you very much, Catherine. May I now introduce Ian Chinapoo?
Thank you, Winston. I'd like to build on three of the points that Catherine made: education, culture, and enforcement. just to expand a little bit on education, I think one of the key points that she raised was that we must have the right people facing off against the utilization of the legislation. So having the right people in drafting, having the right people in enforcement, and having them investing in them so that they can truly carry out the spirit and enforce the legislation. So education and enforcement is inextricably linked. But I would like to expand that education into the point she made about culture and behaviors, because legislation is a detective mechanism. It's really reactive. It happens after the fact. The legislation really represents the codification of our societal values, and how well we inculcate those values into our young people is really what's going to change the culture in the future. Because having more legislation, which is good because it sets the rules for everyone, really does not solve the problem. It's reactive, because most legislation comes about because of some issue that occurred and you're now trying to fix it or close a gap. When our young people look at the environment around them and the values that are espoused, we must ask ourselves, what is the culture that is being ingrained in them, and how much more legislation will need to pass to capture the innovative things that they will come up with in the future if they're being trained in the art of corruption. And that is the cultural aspect of education that I would like to put on the table. Enforcement can only go so far, because the time it takes to build a case, to take it through the courts, and to have a successful prosecution means that the vast majority of unethical and illegal behavior is not being addressed. And therefore, there's an avalanche of experience that's being put out there into our society, and a culture that says you're not going to get caught. And therefore, it makes the legislation, well, I think we had a former police commissioner who said a toothless bulldog. And I think that may have been what he meant. Because what we have created is a society that, whether we like it or not, enables corruption by the fact that there is very little that is being done or can be done to drive prosecution under legislation. So, I mean, Catherine touched on all these points, but I just wanted to put it into the context of young people, because these will be the people who the legislation really is meant to guide. And despite our best efforts, I don't think making legislation work, which is our topic today, is going to be possible unless we foster meaningful cultural change. And that means going into the schools, going into the churches, going into the homes, and reminding people about what made Caribbean society great. And so Wes Hall, really enjoyed your presentation, and I loved what you said. Your mother was the first teacher of integrity, and we need to recapture that moment in our society for the legislation that really is the public face of it to be effective.
When I was a young boy growing up in rural Trinidad and Tobago, Princestown, we never knew or understood something called the law. That was a kind of an abstraction. But you know something? We knew what was right and we knew what was wrong. And it seemed people then did not depend on the law to instruct them or to advise them or to inform them what was right or what was wrong. Afra.
Okay, well, this is a really nice introduction. Good morning. Thank you to the Transparency Institute for inviting me to speak. And thanks to the two colleagues, Ian and Catherine, who spoke before Winston, for that lovely introduction. And you spoke about growing up in Trinidad and Tobago back in the day in Princestown, that semi-rural community, and not really knowing about the law. Well, I knew about the hand of justice, yes. Okay, as we call it.
We all did.
There was the hand of justice of my mother, the rod of correction, and of course of my esteemed grandfather, who never hit me, but had a very stern look, and you knew when you did something wrong. and he would actually beg my mother not to beat me so much. So there's a kind of a culture of correctness, which certainly formed some of my outlook. Now I wanted to start off because we have critical stances. I'm a critical person, and when mistakes are made, I would identify it. But I also think I'd like to put forward something positive, and I want to say that it's always pained me over the years attending this conference to notice the lack of attendance from the people who are in a position to legislate and to create the new laws, and in fact, I would say to be informed by this discourse. So I would like to pause before I launch into what I have to say to recognize Dr. Keith Rowley, who's the leader of the opposition. I would also recognize Mrs. Camille Robinson-Regis, who's sitting behind him in a lovely African gown. And we can't be critical without recognizing when somebody takes a step forward. So I recognize your presence, and I would like, in my own capacity, I'm not the host, I'm welcoming you all. So let's talk. Now, I was also very excited a few nights ago, I think it was Tuesday night. I can't remember, there's been so much hubbub about some other remarks. But I can remember Dr. Rowley putting forward very clearly and boldly on Tuesday night that if the PNM government were returned to office, if the party was returned to office, he would make whistleblower legislation a matter of high priority. And I also want to say that I welcome that, okay? I recognize it and I welcome it. I'll be talking a little bit about those things. The subject at the moment is making legislation work. And Ian, you made a remark about education and culture, and Winston, you made a remark about culture and values and growing up in the olden days. And I want to say that let's step out of the corruption discussion for a second. Are we talking about making legislation work? So it's a broader question. And it's a question about building a stable and an orderly and a progressive society. Those are the frameworks which I place on the question. And when I think about the kind of advertisements I have seen, and you must check them out. Go up on YouTube and see them. In other countries, for drinking and driving. Dramatic, violent, heartbreaking advertisements about why you shouldn't drink and drive, why you should get a taxi home, why you shouldn't do that to your friend. And when I compare that with the quality of the advertisements we have here, in terms of our objectives of legislation, stability, progress, and order, our efforts in this field are very weak, considering how creative a culture we have here. So we need to get with it and have more dynamic, more impactful advertisements, because that is actually how you change behavior, in my opinion. The media is one of those. I think it's a topic later on about the media and, yes, and about the judiciary and about dealing with corruption in the society. Well, drinking and driving is just one example of what I'm talking about. We need to have a more impactful intervention there. The other intervention I would make, I'm talking about making legislation work and taking some alternative views. I'll get to procurement, is the one about metrics. I'm a surveyor. That's my profession. Surveying is the science of measurement. And we are all trained, whether we're quantity surveyors or land surveyors, or in my case, valuation and property and so on. We're all trained about measurement and comparison and analysis of numbers. And very little of that takes place in the society, in the broader public discourse. So for instance, let me give another example. We had a case about 18 months ago when the gentleman who's the Speaker of the House was alleged to have had a certain high mark, I think it was 91%, in a management account exam for his MBA. I don't know if it's true, it was alleged. Now I would have liked UWI, I was asking for it, I was the only one asking for it. I would have liked UWI, the Institute of Business, to have published, not the names, the marks for the MBA Management Accounts exam for the last 10 years. Let people understand what an outlier, let me use statistical language, what an outlier 91% is. But we don't have that kind of discourse here. We're lacking the discourse. So everything, because of the preponderance of lawyers, and I'm very pleased to be on a platform with no lawyers. Don't take it wrong, anybody. The preponderance, and Mrs. Robinson-Regis, don't take it wrong. I'm very pleased to be on a platform with no lawyers because we can have a refreshing quality of discourse. Now, because everything is taken as a case, to use the phrase on a case-by-case basis, so you draw from precedent, but it's case by case. So everything is analyzed on that case. What did you know and when did you know it, and what did you know and when did you know it? We make very poor use of metrics in terms of how we think about problems and how we can analyze the problems, which feeds back into the philosophical question of how we make legislation to deal with the problems. So we need to promote, apart from these shocking advertisements, to eliminate the negative behaviors, we need to promote the use of metrics, the basic fundamental facts of the matter. What is the mark of the last 10 years of candidates in the MBA in management accounts? We need to promote that kind of analytical approach to be able to, and I can talk as a surveyor, that approach shows you everything. Trust me, we use numbers, that's what we use for a living. It shows you nothing could hide, you know. Numbers is one hell, don't take the language wrong, one hell of a thing, sorry, Reverend Hall. Okay? Your speech was marvelous, by the way. Now, also, we're getting to the implementation question. Let's get into it now. And we have to learn from history. And right now, we've been in a battle for the last X amount of years, JCC and its colleagues at Transparency, and different colleagues at Chamber of Commerce and the manufacturers. We've been in a battle trying to get a new procurement law. We didn't get everything, we got most of what we wanted. And I'm going to stick a pin here before I talk about the procurement law to talk about what we can learn from history. The procurement law, Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, Act number 1 of 2015, is intended to replace the Central Tenders Board Act. But you know the most interesting thing about the Central Tenders Board Act, when you look at it, when you actually hold the Central Tenders Board Act in your hand and you look at it, printed on the first page is Central Tenders Board Act 1961. And we need to get context and get learning. In 61, Dr. Williams was riding high. The PNM was in power. They controlled the majority of the legislature. The opposition forces, like how they are now, were very diminished. The whole civil society lobby that we have developed over these years, it was almost not there. In a kind of a way, the PNM almost had a captive civil service in terms of the civil service going along with what the government wanted to do and so on. The picture I'm painting is that there was a vastly different picture in 61 to what it is now, to what a government faces now, any government. Yeah. We wanted 29 seats. You're facing all kind of opposition. Yet, the first Central Tenders Board, the actual board of individuals who were sworn in with the powers to implement the Central Tenders Board Act, they weren't sworn in until 1966. So it took 5 years for a government with all of that influence and seats and connections and the wave of national pride and nationalism and so on, to put the act in force. It took 5 years. By 1979, without going into a whole history lesson, they started to dismantle it with some amendments in Section 20 and so on. We're not going to go into that. So we need to be mindful of two things. It takes a long time to implement stuff. Our target, just to let you understand how ambitious we are, we aim for the sky so that we can hit the top of the mango tree. We're not aiming for no mango tree. We aim for the sky. And although this new act is very, very good, it didn't contain everything we wanted. We are aiming, in terms of the group, speaking on behalf of the group this morning, we are aiming to have the thing implemented in 6 months. There are powerful instruments in there to deal with corruption and to deal with the waste and the theft of our public money. It has gone on for many, many years. It's gotten to a high point in the country. And it's destabilizing the country because the senses of good order, what we could do, what we shouldn't do, what is right and wrong, that is fading from view. It's no longer a question of merit. It's no longer a question of you having a better idea than me. We're really down to ideas of who you know, and more to the point, Reverend Hall, who know you. If they don't know you, your goose is cooked. They have to know you, okay? We have entered this push to get this act implemented as fast as possible. I would say it here. Now, it would be remiss of me to sit here and don't say it. I would say it here that if the election goes in a particular direction and Dr. Rowley and his colleagues are victorious, I would make myself clear, we'll be pushing just as hard with the PNM administration to make sure the correct thing happens. We are not for either side. We're pushing just as hard with the individuals sitting there, particularly Mrs. Robinson, she knows us from other incarnations, and Dr. Rowley, pushing just as hard to make sure the correct thing is done. The two things that are outstanding in implementing the procurement law, let me tell you what the two things are, because President Kamona assented to the law in the first 2 weeks of January. I think it was the 10th or 11th. The two things that are outstanding is that regulations need to be created. It's a framework law. So the actual conduct of an authority like TNTech or WASA or UDICOT would actually be governed by the regulations within the law. That is a piece of work, an intense piece of work that is happening at the moment. The fact of the matter is, We need the correct people to be appointed to the procurement regulator. No academic, however bright, no person of certain persuasions, however bright, could handle this. The corruption problem in the country is immense. The people are very powerful, they are very well advised, they are very ruthless. Okay, I say that, they're ruthless. And the people who have to take on that have to be people of a certain kind of fortitude. You can't have anybody who's weak, half-hearted, on the one hand this and on the other hand that. That's no office for that. This is crime fighting office number one. You need to have serious people there. So those are the two things. I'm just giving you an outline. Those are the two things we need to do. We need to make sure a proper body of regulations is in place. And we need to make sure people have the correct experience and the correct character. They have to have experience of fighting corruption. Somebody who hasn't done it, speaking as somebody who's done it, somebody who hasn't done it wouldn't know. If you have never actually had to confront corruption in your family, in your firm, in your profession, among your colleagues in cabinet or whoever, you don't know what it is. It's just a newspaper article for you. It's just something on TV about somebody else in some other country. You have to have that experience to get down in there and fight with it. And that is who we want in this new organization. We want serious people. We want to make a difference. This is an opportunity for Trinidad and Tobago. We've come very, very far. This is an opportunity for Trinidad and Tobago to get back on track as far as that is concerned. It's not a guarantee, it's an opportunity. The last thing I want to say before I hand over to the chair of the session is that, in fact, we are seeing a lot of eyewash. I use the word eyewash on the campaign trail. So certain people get onto their platform and they wave and they say that we gave you the procurement law. We gave it to you. Well, I could tell you the law passed in Parliament on the 16th of December 2014. President Kumar signed it on the 11th of January. But the law is not in place. Exactly. The procurement law is not in place. It needs to be in place. We need to take back our space, regain our sense of stability, and continue to move in some kind of progress. So those are my points on the question. Over to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Afra. So, want to encourage the colleagues to engage in interaction because we now come to the point where we have legislation, we want action. And in the continuum from legislation to action, there are issues related to formation of regulations, putting in train the necessary institutional framework, as you have described it, a lot of work. We are dealing with, in the context of a situation in Trinidad and Tobago that is dire, that calls for swift action, calls for immediate action, calls for urgency. We are dealing in, and I want to pose this question to the panel, and we are dealing with a jurisdiction, 1.3 million people, a certain quantum of professional and related expertise upon which you can draw to confront the plethora of development challenges that confront the United States of America, Great Britain, Soviet Russia, what have you. We all have to have, in this world of globalization, we confront the same range of development issues. And it is in this context, I throw it out to the panel now about how do we see us moving ahead in a much more effective way, much more understandably and acceptably defined path towards dealing with some of these challenges that would ensure that we make our legislation effective, make our legislation work.
Well, I'll start off by saying, Afra spoke about metrics. The other thing we are lacking sadly in Trinidad and Tobago is data and information to help us make informed decisions. And we need to ensure that we have that data in place if we're going to draft proper legislation. So we need to look at fixing our CSO office so that we can get the data that we need, and we don't have to go to international or other countries and use their data in making decisions for us here. We need to be able to use our local data. Having said that, however, the world, as you said, is a global place, and we don't have to start from scratch for everything. We do have limited resources, we do have limited expertise, and we can borrow, but not wholesale, from other countries who have walked this way already. But to borrow and to ensure that we now change that and adapt that to what suits us, our cultures we spoke about before, our small size of population that we're dealing with, maybe our lack of proper overall regulatory systems that other developed worlds might have and we don't have here. So we need to make those amendments when we look at what is dealt with outside. And perhaps also looking at not just the developed world in particular, but other countries in the developing world who may have probably a little more similar circumstances as we have here, and look at legislation and how they have attacked certain issues. I find that often we go to, developed world, probably Canada, not meaning anything against Canada, and we say because Canada was a Commonwealth country, that we could take this and that from Canada. But they were a Commonwealth country, but look where Canada has reached versus where we have reached, right? I mean, they could afford to put certain legislation in place because they know they have the overall infrastructure and regulatory controls to take care of certain things that we don't have here. So, so I say those two things. We need data. We need local data, information, and we also need to be able to look at the globalized world and see what we can use from that and adapt to our local situations.
Ian?
Let me start and build on what Catherine said and the question that Winston asked by, of course, making the statement that no society is immune from corruption. Corruption involves people, and you'll always have good people and not so good people who may have ambition, and let's call it the misuse of ambition would lead them to, and Afra was right, we're not just talking about corruption, we're talking about all legislation. I like the fact that you use the breathalyzer as an example, because there are many societies that actually do not have breathalyzer legislation, but do not have the drunk driving and statistics that we do. So the legislation by itself is not, it's how you also communicate the legislation. That's a very big point Afra made. And so it's not just putting it into place, but educating people. It's not enough to say when you reach the court that ignorance of the law is no excuse. You have to teach people about the legislation and what it means. And it comes right back to the values and communicating that from the home come forward. Building on what Catherine said about not reinventing the wheel, I would also want to apply that to education. We can take a page out of the inspectorate, Catherine, when you were there, when I know there was a big thrust to send people abroad to learn about securities legislation and central bank operations elsewhere, so that you can bring that back to Trinidad and Tobago and train nationals to be skilled at enforcing regulation and so on. And that has yielded a fairly strong financial sector for us that is well regulated. So we have examples within our society where it may not be legislation, it may be called regulations and so on, but where people do adhere to the rule of best practice in their industry. Why can't we learn from that? In our manufacturing and energy sector, we do have a fairly low incidence of accidents and so on, and that is because we have a lot of experience that has been brought in from the first world and elsewhere, where we have standards around how people behave, how they operate in a manufacturing or the oil sector, that environment, which is a high-risk environment. You know, I mean, there have been accidents, there have been challenges, but we do have good examples that we can draw on within our society and build on that. You look for the good and you expand. We also must communicate fully and openly, and that comes right back to the statistics. We must be able to get the information out there so we can make the changes that we need. Let's take a page out of the corporate world. The corporate world, when we train our staff, we talk about continuous improvement. We talk about making and forming high-powered or high-performing teams. All that means is that you learn from your mistakes and you don't make them again. Why can't we incorporate the examples of successful operations and make the information available so that we can learn from them as a society? And that's important. When you look, you talked about, you know, all the developments in the world, Winston, and what's going on. Look at, I mean, we talk about Russia, you talk about Ukraine, you look at the situations out there, and what you see, whether it's called democracy or not, is that you have a few controlling the lives of the many. And that goes back to time immemorial. When that happens, people seek their own interest against that of the wider society's interest. We have a small society. Our society is somewhat vocal, but as Afra and creative, as you said, Afra, we must adopt that empowered situation in our societal groups to have the courage to speak out and come out and say what you know is happening around you. Because what happens is that you speak about everybody else, but not those around you. That's our legacy in our society. We criticize everyone else, but the things that we directly know about, we don't talk about.
Some people argue, but we have the laws, there are laws on the books, there are institutions that already exist for the administration of such laws, but yet there's no enforcement. What's the issue here, Afra?
Well, you did tell me you were going to give me a provocative question. And there are no lawyers up here, so I could say a few things. But seriously, the point is that we have a very interesting and confused mentality. So if you speak with most people in this sort of position of the people who are colleagues here, they would tell you that in fact they want this law or they want that law, and people want an improvement to the Integrity Act, people want a better procurement law, people want better securities laws, and so on and so on. And the point I would make is that to put it in a Trinidadian balance, we have a man on the street talking to a woman on the street, and they're discussing designing and building a rocket to go to the moon. They get a flat tire and they can't change the tire in the car. We have low-hanging fruit all around us, and we don't do anything about it. The biggest example I would give, because I like examples, is the example about the CL financial bailout. The biggest financial scandal that's taken place in the Caribbean in 100 years. And up to now, I don't know if anybody from the central bank is here, I don't care if they are. Up to now, nobody, because the central bank has a book of regulations, which is within its power to enforce, called the fit and proper regulations. That fit and proper regulations actually establishes, it prescribes criteria for who can actually own a financial company, a financial institution, who can audit it, who can be a director, and who can be an officer of it. And by any lights, certainly by the standards and the fit and proper rules, everybody involved with CL Financial, all of them who are on those boards of the failed companies, none of them are fit and proper anymore. But of course, some of them are in cabinet. You know, Dr. Tiwari. You know, some of them are running other financial institutions now. And that's a clear and present case. We don't have to get technical about it. You have to discuss engineering and steel and concrete. There's a commission of inquiry going on now. I don't talk about that. We have a clear and present case of not wanting to pick the low-hanging fruit. The savings of generations of Caribbean people were destroyed and looted. I say it again, the savings were destroyed and looted. and the governor and the central bank under the last governor, as the district, he was UWI's first distinguished fellow. You see? He was UWI's first distinguished fellow, Hewitt Williams. The current governor is continuing the same thing. They're not taking any action against these financial bandits. They're not taking any action against them. And as a result of that, we in a society, Winston, continue to anoint the perpetrators. To borrow that phrase, Reverend, to anoint them. We continue to anoint them. So the University of the West Indies, which ought to be one of the Caribbean success stories, anoints Hewitt Williams. And the People's Partnership, which was replacing the mistaken PNM led by Mr. Manning, they anoint Dr. Tiwari, and on we go. And at some point we have to draw a line. I'm not going to discuss anything high and technical about section X, Y, and Z of this law. There's a fit and proper law on all of those people. And the 5 companies were CL Financial, Clico, British American, CMMB, and Clico Investment Bank. Any of those directors in those 5 companies, they're not fit and proper. They certainly shouldn't be in our parliament. But here we are. So we need to pick the low-hanging fruit to get back to that country boy metaphor of yours, Winston, and Dr. Rowley Tobago life. We need to pick the low-hanging fruit before we can discuss climbing the mountain to pick the mango tree over the hill by the next neighbor. They have a mango tree in your yard. If you're hungry, eat your own mangoes. So we need to get with it and get the certitude and the center, the moral fortitude to pick that fruit. And it will mean some people we know and like wouldn't be able to run in the race anymore. Unless you have the fortitude to deal with the people you know and like, you're not ready. Coming back to who could regulate about procurement and good legislation.
And this is a very fit and proper point now to engage the audience. And I hope it is sufficiently provocative so that individuals within the group would make their contribution to this conversation that began in the couch and now extends throughout the halls of the ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open. And we have 2 gentlemen so far, Mr. Hugh Howard first and Victor Hart afterwards.
That legislation alone cannot be the talisman of moral people.
Yeah.
My understanding of this is that moral and spiritual values must be preeminent. Accordingly, we cannot speak about having people observe legislation if we find that the persons who create the legislation do not observe them. In other words, lawmakers have become lawbreakers. I therefore believe that any serious attempt must begin with the education of our young people, preferably from kindergarten, but certainly from the secondary school level and the primary school level. We believe that if people are taught that, look, instant gratification and what you may see as progress may not be sustainable and not be in your best interest. I've heard one politician make the statement that he has seen certain persons who did not have a fob within a short period of years got deep pockets. What this is doing is that the other young people believe, well, that's the way to go. But if we can let them know that if you continue that way, eventually your children and grandchildren are going to be the sufferers, then I think we'll be making some progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. Victor?
My name is Victor Hart. I'm a former chairman of the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, an organization that I joined 10 years ago, almost to the day. I learned of its existence while serving as a commissioner into the Piarco Airport corruption scandal. And one of the witnesses who came before us was Boyd Reed, who I see sitting here on my right, to tell us about the existence of the Transparency Institute and the Integrity Pact, which is a model program that they have that, if adopted in Trinidad and Tobago, could act as a major disincentive to corruption in terms of construction projects primarily. Serving on the Commission of Inquiry changed my life forever because I saw it firsthand, for the first time, the kind of corruption that was taking place in Trinidad and Tobago through the evidence that was being brought before us over a 16-month period. When I heard Boyd talk about the Transparency Institute, I vowed then that after the Commission of Inquiry, I would devote the remainder of my retirement to working to promote transparency and accountability in the private and public sectors. And so it was I joined the Transparency Institute. And after 10 years, I must say, I remain optimistic, but you know, the slowness of the pace of change is really sometimes hard to bear. But what I want to say to this gathering is that when we look at the enemy of, amongst us, they really come from among the leadership in our society without integrity. Because the major damage that is being done to our economy, being done to our national psyche, is damage being done by the leaders in the country. Not the guys from the ghetto who are sometimes just following examples or just trying to survive, but the leadership without integrity in the society of Trinidad and Tobago are the ones who are doing serious damage to our country's economy and the country's psyche. What I've been hoping for, and my friends will tell you that I remain optimistic, and I say every year, this is the year in which we are going to arrest and bring to trial a few big fish and maybe jail those who have been found guilty. And every year I say it, and Christmas comes around, and I say, well, it's going to happen next year. And I remain optimistic. I see signs of improvements, slow as those improvements are. And it continues to give me encouragement to continue the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years through the Transparency Institute. So I want us, therefore, to bear in mind that cultural change, is important. Getting into the schools is important. But what is most important is to start holding the big fish in this country accountable for their misdeeds, because they're the ones who are really messing up, our country's future and setting a bad examples for our country's youth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. May I invite Olubisi?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. I would just like to go back. This seems to be going back to the contribution. I think it was Mr. Chinapoo in his initial remarks spoke about the law or legislation being reactive. And that set me thinking, and I was wondering if, as a fundamental principle, that is how I actually see the law, and how we as a country, as a people, must see the law. And so based on that, the idea, it seems to me, that he was getting across was that the only way that the law comes into play is when you have to punish wrongdoing. I don't know if I'm getting you correct. Only when a problem arises, then the law comes into being. And I want to think that well, I'm asking myself the question, is it possible to see the creation of law and the implementation of law in a more positive, proactive light, in which the law governs how the society and the people in the society see themselves, how they see their relationship with each other, and how they respond to how they live in the environment in which they live. Because I feel that that is important, how one sees the law functioning within the society has significance in terms of how the society runs itself, right? Another thing that was mentioned is that when some of us, I suppose Mr. Chinapoo and others like me, were growing up, there was no need for the law because somehow we knew what was right and we behaved in a way, you know, we did the right thing. And I'm wondering if that is totally correct, because in a sense I feel that there was a law, that there was law, there was a set of rules, a set of regulations that guided how we behaved, and everybody knew what the law was. And therefore, even if it was not written down, but there was knowledge of what right was and what the rules were, and when you were going outside of the boundaries of acceptable behavior, there were laws that governed that. And therefore, I don't accept the view that at another time, at an earlier period, there was no law. The final thing I would like to say, somebody mentioned about the drafting of laws, and not going too much into the issue of whether we have competent people or not competent people to draft the laws. One of the things as a layperson that I find about the application of the law when you hear about it, when it turns up in the court, is that it seems to me, and I may be wrong, I'm not a lawyer, it seems to me that in drafting laws, a lot of emphasis is placed on the procedural dimension of laws, what you do first, second, third, you know, what steps to take, and so on. One of the things, for example, that I have about our present constitution, I know we're not talking about constitution, you know, per se, but that there is a high emphasis on procedural matters, and as I think Ms. Kumar said, you know, the whole business about policy and philosophy underpinning what the law is all about, there is not enough emphasis on that. And lastly, what I would like to say about this whole emphasis on procedures, it opens up the way for so-called legal minds to treat the law as something that you exploit technicalities. So you look for loopholes. And if anything, in terms of the application of the law, what we see most of all is the exploitation of loopholes in the procedures. And I don't know how that can ever be the route to go in terms of getting what I think it was Afra Raymond spoke about as a orderly and stable society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Constitution Reform Forum, and I want to congratulate you on that point. I think Dr. Rowley had a point to make. Please.
Mike, behind you, yeah.
Thank you very much for allowing me a moment. I just want to acknowledge Reverend Hall. And I wasn't going to say anything here because I came today to listen. But Victor Hart's comment a moment ago forced me to approach this microphone against the background of how this conversation has gone. And Afra's comment about the low-hanging fruit. Victor said his life was changed when he was exposed to Boyd Reed. And it reminded me that what we're really facing as we go through this exercise is a requirement to find a solution. And I've been with this for quite a while, and I think the solution lies the beginning with establishing and recognizing the purpose for establishing institutions. And societies that are succeeding have institutions that function. And if for whatever reason the institutions that we've agreed upon, with the regulations that we have fashioned and agreed upon, if those institutions fail, then nothing else will succeed. And that is why Piarco Airport, where Victor got involved in this, changed his life, and got him involved in this kind of thing. I just want to remind gatherers here, particularly local people who are in this room, that when the Piarco matter was being forcefully dealt with by the Parliament, which is how it should have been, that institution, functioning in trying to remove secrecy from the Piarco operations. I, as a member of Parliament, doing that, was evicted from the Parliament indefinitely. That happened in Trinidad and Tobago. A member of Parliament treating with Piarco Airport and the corruption that was supposed to be taking place there. The institution failed because the institution intervened in its operations to have the member evicted indefinitely. So I've concluded from that that you have to have the recognition of the institution and have the institutions function. What is happening is that we elevate individuals above the institutions. And that was Afra's point, that not who you know, but who know you, and vice versa. Because we are now a society of individuals, some of whom have publicly elevated themselves above the law, which then makes the law meaningless. And that brings me to the point that it is the secrecy in the operations of the institutions that preserve these individuals. And therefore there needs to be a sea change which puts us in a place where there ought to be no secrecy in public business except in extremely small doses and for national security and other. The element, the component of secrecy must be so small as to be unvisible. And that takes me to the point that the advanced society of the United States, when Richard Nixon tried to protect himself and his wrongdoing from corrupting, as they were corrupting the American society, it was secrecy that they turned to. And of course, the institution of the US Supreme Court prevailed and forced Richard Nixon and his cronies to release those tapes in the famous Watergate crossroads in the United States. We have to then understand that people will prosper where secrecy prevails. So my advocacy in this situation is that in places like Trinidad and Tobago, minimize the secrecy and hold people accountable so that institutions can function, and then you begin to correct the problems we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Did I see a hand? Yes, sir.
In the interest of showing just how good we are and in destigmatizing MACO, let me publicly state today that I am a MACO, MACO, and it stands for Monitoring All Community Occurrences. And in doing that, we will get straight into, what's happening with our corruption. The other thing I wanted to point out is, and Catherine again, I think, said it, sometimes you want to say, let's just stop everything and start anew, because our complexities are so much. Democratic representative parliamentary representation in itself is a diametrically opposed set of dynamics that, let me put it this way. If I'm in San Fernando West, which is where I am, and I elect an MP, and he's supposed to, correct me if I'm wrong, look after the interests of, you know, his constituents, that type of thing. And we're out of work, and I go to him and, you know, make an appointment and everything, and says, listen, is there anything we can do? I run a company, my guys are going out to work, and he talks to the minister in housing, and we get a contract. I think most of us would say he did it properly. But isn't that to the other person slightly off-center? So where do we draw that fine line? And I tell you what, using Canada, Professor Green gave us this example. And I think he was telling us something about it. The CNE, Canadian National Exhibition, which is once a year or something, the provincial government put together a small band, a small little committee, for the new ministers to call in whenever they faced something and they weren't sure whether they were going to be off-center. And he was giving us a particular example. At the CNE, a minister wrote into this thing saying, look, I got a whole set of tickets to go to it. Should I accept them? And here was the reply, so far from what I'm about to say Trinidad does. The reply went something like this. Yes, if you're the minister under which the CNE falls, so to speak, certainly you want what we would call the permanent secretary and so. But if you're not, you should return the tickets, or you should keep just for yourself and your wife and go. Mirror that against what I think I read in the papers, where when you rent that Hazley Crawford Stadium for something, I think it was sport, they said, the government, and we should really call them business managers, because they don't do a good word on government, connotates that we're subservient to them, which we're not. They have to give them 100 tickets, I think, first. And I'm thinking, why are we, the taxpayers, building the stadium, paying the ministers, who then get 100 tickets while we get 0? So, and the reason I bring this up is because, as I forget your name said,
Afra.
about the low-hanging mango.
Afra.
Very often we talk about this thing, corruption, interculture and education. Do we really understand, the lay person, what corruption is? How are you going to deal with it when me giving you a ticket or saying, don't worry, I know a person, we go get tickets, and we don't see it as corruption? How do we start that? We're talking all these nice little things up here, but at the very base, and I need to talk to Derek about an idea I have that might bring it back to down here, where the guy going to school understands what corruption is. And I think it was Mr. Chinapoo, is it, who mentioned the media. And again, this was a case in the Toronto Star. An immigrant couple had gone to Canada, had done really well, created a construction company, and then, of course, the husband found himself a little girl, and she filed for divorce, the wife that is. And the judge, in giving his judgment, gave the wife more than she asked for. And this is how the corruption came out. Otherwise, we would never know. The judge said in his judgment, if I remember rightly, that she had done such a stalwart job and was so intrinsically involved in creating the successful company with her husband that she should get more. And of course, there was an investigative reporter, and he was pushing against, you know, the corruption of this particular firm always getting government contracts. And when he tried to get the wife to get, she said, look, I'm terribly sorry. I'd like to talk to you, but I got a Jamaican cruise plan with my children. But if you want, you can come with your wife and I'll pay for you and the kids. I don't have to tell you that that investigative article never came about. But what's important here is how important it is to have the media not be corrupt. Had the judge not said anything, no one would have known that the investigative reporter had gone on a cruise paid for by the person, and therefore the possibility of finding that firm guilty of getting contracts from the Bill Davis government, you understand? Let me not go on, because I know we want to go and have some stuff. Thank you. It's been very stimulating, and I would like you all just to think about what I was saying about, do we define corruption first? I think you said, what is it? The word discipline, for example, right? I think the minute you say discipline, we instinctively think of, or it connotates in us something hit, lashed. Nothing like self-discipline, simply corruption. Similarly, corruption. Is it like hold 500 and give me it? Or is it, hey, you have tickets for Panorama Boy, don't worry, I know a person I'll get. Or is it Johnny Gopal saying, reach in late here because I have to drive from South because TTTTI and everybody else refuses to give us the opportunity to have these things down South.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Good morning. I want to be honest, right? I begged for $700 yesterday, and that's why I'm here. You know? But what made me beg for that $700? On the television, the gentleman from the British Council, I've been correct, right? Said that this generation is more or less tainted, so we have to concentrate on the next generation. And I'm representing two communities here, Gonzales and a community in Pity Valley, just at the end where the Maxi turn. In Gonzales, I'm part of an organization. We asked the government for a unit, Mr. Sandy, and he gave us 4 containers. They dress it up, and we have something called the Gonzales Joint Community Services Center. In Pity Valley, I'm a member of a church, Christian church, World Outreach Church Ministries. We settled in another community, the communities where people do like this, risk or at risk. You know, we are accustomed to that now. The lifestyle is that I've taught my children to hit the ground. We're watching TV, you hear rat-a-tat, you watch TV from the ground. In Gonzales, they have put some community police in this center. And I'll give you one family experience. I took a woman to see an Indian woman from Port of Spain, East Port of Spain, who has brought up her children pushing drugs. It's part. So what we expect from those children is what the parents did. Now in that community, this center with the community police, we have to kind of father these children and make a way for this community. And what I'm here to do on behalf of both communities, because in the other community, there was a couple that came out and we took them on the church. We married them, cleaned them up because the guy was a pusher, his wife was smoking, they have 2 children. When we put them in an apartment, they put the bed by the front door because they were not accustomed to a bedroom. They live in one room with an extended family. They bathe in springs. Now, I'm here to build bridges between these 2 communities and the people that I see here, who I consider movers and shakers, and who I feel have something to offer to these communities. Because, like everything else, these communities, corruption is genetic, it is endemic. The value system in these communities are not what we consider normal. There's a whole different value system. It used to be called the Jamet lifestyle, which we feel is one thing, but it was slaves who ran away and went into East Port of Spain and settled. And in slavery, you can't get jobs, you don't have careers. So I think the women were, Bryson Road was the Gaza Strip. George Street and Charlotte Street always famous for netty, give me the thing where you got in your belly. So we're looking at that value system as opposed to what we learn when we go to college. And I'm here to say that the center that we got in Gonzales has been so kind of successful. One, in bringing them mainstream and then making the police part of these communities. The police have now become part of the solution. And what I'm here to do is to try to build bridges and ask very politely and humbly, if we could take some of this, if we could borrow some of you people to partner with us in Gonzales, because they are now copying our unit in Beetham, and they are coming to us for examples on what we have done, how we have worked with children. We had a camp last year for 90 children, 95 children on average, where we didn't even get funded. Police took money out of their pockets, and we have to father these people's children because, let me be short, anybody who can help, anybody who could volunteer and who's willing, because we need to put some of these values into these children. I'm asking on behalf of these two communities for help. That's why I'm here.
Thank you very, very, very much. And in fact, fitting way to bring it to a close, because it emphasizes one of the aspects of the work of transparency, the work of all of us who are involved in this particular kind of exercise, is that it cannot remain at the level at which we discuss here. We have to be part and parcel of the transformation that must take place in communities, in the school, and we must be in it for the long haul. Now, this has been a conversation initiated in the couch, but embracing the entire community who are here this morning. And in a conversation, no one does any summary at the end, because we have all been participants, we have all listened, we have all heard, and we have all drawn lessons from it. Clearly, at the end of it all, the institution, transparency, will draw some specific points to take our work forward. But mine is not the responsibility for summarizing what has happened here in a very rich exchange this morning. My only regret is that we didn't have enough time to have a deeper and continuing conversation.